Hello, everyone. Welcome to this week's episode of Catholic Re.Con testimonies from reverts and converts. I'm your host, Eddie Trask. And this week's guest is Keith Albert Little, who many of you probably are familiar with. He runs a YouTube channel called Cordial Catholic. That's how I stumbled across his work. This is probably a year ago. And come to find out, he's been on the journey home. Come to find out also, as he'll get into, just like myself, he was at one point a non-denominational Protestant. First of all, Keith, thank you. To be on this show is such a pleasure for you to say yes, because like I said, I've been tracking your channel. And what got me early on was the fact that you had such a diverse group of people, and an interview you did with Austin, Gospel Simplicity, I believe that's the channel. That was striking because of the charity that you both showed in that exchange. So I just really appreciate it. But as it relates to your testimony, I didn't dive into the Journey Home interview on purpose. I'd love to hear from your point of view, where did this begin and where are you currently?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on the show. First of all, Eddie, it's a pleasure to be here, and you're doing fantastic work on your channel as well. So I really appreciate this opportunity. Yeah, well, this is a funny journey for me. I actually began blogging in the Catholic blogosphere before I was Catholic, actually, which is kind of funny. I was on the journey to conversion and was picked up by somebody because I wrote an article about thoughts in the Catholic Church, and they thought, oh, this guy seems cool. I wasn't even Catholic yet. So my journey and appearance on the journey home began before I really was even Catholic in many of the corners where I was doing things early on. But my own journey kind of begins, I guess, really excuse me. I am nursing a bit of a cough still, so I apologize to your viewers. I have a cough button. I'll try to hit it as fast as I can if I feel a cough coming. So sorry. There we go. It began for me, I guess. I grew up really in what I call a Christian home without Christ, and it's kind of an oxymoron. But really, we were a household that valued honesty and charity and compassion and being good neighbors and recycling. And we had all these Christian values. I don't know if cycling is a Christian value or not, but all these values of that I was taught that were instilled in me as a kid growing up, but not with Christ at the center of those, not with that purpose behind it of Jesus, of being Christian. And I went to church a few times in different contexts, at Easter or Christmas, and they were non-Catholic Christian churches. So United Church of Canada, maybe Presbyterian Church, these kind of small kind of mainline churches up here in Canada. And it was around the age of, I think, 13 or 14, in going into my second year of high school, that I had an encounter with actually a guy who was Wiccan, of all things.
No kidding.
Yeah, I was a band nerd. I played the saxophones, all of them. And we were having a end of year party at a friend's house. And when I say party, I mean we're band nerds, so we're really, we're drinking C+, Crush or orange soda, but around a campfire and popping Jiffy Pops. It was getting really
out of control. Yeah.
Oh, it was a wild party. It was a wild party. Somebody brought the gummy bears, I think, and we lost control. But we were there, and the friend of a friend was there. This guy who was very mysterious and kind of interesting to me, and to a lot of us, and he had kind of long hair and lots of rings on his fingers, and he smelled like incense or something, right? And he was very interesting to us band nerds, and so we were kind of chatting with him around the campfire this one night, and he was talking to us about how the world is bigger than we can imagine, and all things are connected, and there's these different kind of roots to things that. And for the first time, Eddie, and this maybe is my ignorance, maybe a bit embarrassing, I realized that, wait a second, yeah, I'm not the middle of the universe. I'm the center of the universe. This guy's saying has some truth to it. And I hadn't thought that way before. So I went home and pre-Google days, tried to find online on the internet, as it was back then, information about being Wiccan, because this guy was Wiccan. I learned this from him, and there was nothing really out there that made any sense to me. There was a couple of websites that were very disjointed, and I didn't understand what I was reading. And so,
Yeah.
my next step, I think, thank goodness, was to think, okay, well, if I can't be Wiccan, like what? This is awakened in me a thought about the universe is bigger than myself, and I'm not the center of the universe, and there's more out there. So how can I scratch this itch? How can I find the root of that? And I had one friend who was Christian. Actually, my best friend growing up, his name was Brent. He was a Christian, and we didn't discuss faith at all in any way as kids. We discussed Star Wars and Star Trek equal time to both. We discussed, comic books and these kinds of things that nerdy guys do, and never faith. But I knew he was a Christian because on Sundays growing up, he was always busy. He couldn't hang out on Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon. He was doing stuff. He was at church, and I think back now to that witness, that he didn't even say anything to me about his faith. He didn't evangelize, but I knew from his life, that from the things he did in his life and didn't do in his life, that he was Christian. And when it came time to find somebody to ask a question about faith, he was the guy that I asked. And long story short, I ended up going to church with him and beginning to go to his youth group, a very cool youth group. Met in the kind of a double wide, like portable kind of trailer with the parishioners, or I guess I don't know what he called them, but members of that church gave their donated their old couches to the youth group. So it's just this big trailer thing full of old couches and a cool stage for the band. And Brent and I ran the soundboard at the back of the youth group. And so another thing that really stands out for me in thinking about my journey is how I became involved with his youth group. He drew me in to the youth group, but also getting involved right away. Like I was the guy with him doing the soundboard. And so I bought into not just the faith, but I got involved right away in the faith and began building my faith through being involved in doing stuff with him. So I became a non-denominational Christian at that point, committed to Christ. I said the prayer. I have one really interesting moment for me where I was on the precipice of kind of becoming, a Christian, age 13, 14. And I really had questions about, would God accept me? Did he want me? And it was a weird question to ask because I had no background in the problem of evil or of sin. I had no concept of sin whatsoever, but I had this thought in my head that, well, if God is God, if there's a creator God out there, if there's somebody who's made the universe, does he want me? Am I acceptable to him? And it was a weird thought. I don't even know where it really came from, even all these years later, where that kind of thought came from, but it came. And I had this instant where I was heading home, after hanging out at the park or something in the middle of the summer, about a month after this first kind of awakening that I had around the campfire. I was on the precipice of becoming Christian. I'd been with Brent for a bit and going to his youth group, and I thought, okay, I'm going to try this thing. And I turned the corner up my street, and this guy that I had bullied in elementary school for years, in grade 7 and 8, I bullied this guy, was right there in the middle of the sidewalk in front of me, and he was strung out on drugs. And I knew he was. I could tell from his face he was on drugs. He didn't look well. He looked angry. And the guy that I bullied in grade 7 and 8, who was smaller than me, was now way bigger than me, taller, bigger, more built, and looked very dangerous to me. So here I am with this guy on the sidewalk in front of me, confronting me, kind of like, I'm going to beat you up. And he began yelling at me. He knew who I was right away. He began, you bullied me. I'm going to beat you up, whatever he said. A more colorful language, I think, than that, Eddie. And I, in that moment, I panicked. I didn't know what to do. I was freaking out. And I told a lie. I said, you can't beat me up. I live in this house right here. There's my house. I'm going home. And it wasn't my house. It was a house on my block, but a neighbor's house, 10 houses down. And he turns and I turn, and we look at this house, and there's a person standing in the window. This older lady, a motherly figure standing in the window. And he thought it was my mom, probably. And I thought, I don't know who this is, but I'm glad she's there. Probably in hindsight, heard the yelling and screaming, came to her window to look at what was going on. But in that moment, he saw her and he took off running. And I thought, gosh, I'm saved I just got saved from being beat up severely by this guy who was strung out on drugs. I ran home, and Eddie, I'll never forget. I can picture it in my mind still. I don't even know why, again, where this instinct came from. But I went to my room, closed my door, laid on the floor and wept, my face on the floor, prostrate on the floor. I had no idea that was an ancient Christian, symbol that we do, as Catholics, we prostrate ourselves for different purposes and reasons. I assumed this ancient Christian prayer position, and I said, in that instant, God, I know I'm not worthy of you. I know I've just told, even just now I've told a lie, but if you can accept me, I want to know you. I want to be a Christian. And that kind of launched my journey. I don't know where those thoughts came from, the instinct, but there it was. And a real grace and a blessing for me to I guess the Holy Spirit maybe brought those things to the surface of my mind, right? But that then really informed my journey and very quickly launched me very deep into my Christian journey. And so I can speed ahead to becoming Catholic. I can dig deeper here. What do you think?
No. I think you should dig deeper into what you just mentioned. And I'm curious about, you were saying 13, 14, and then you mentioned junior high. Tell me how old you were when you had that moment where you're crying in your room.
Yeah, this was probably age 13, age 14.
Oh, it was 13. Okay.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, it was. It was that same summer. So about a month after I met this Wiccan guy and began having these thoughts and going to my friend Brent's youth group. And then I had this kind of moment. And that really was when I committed my life, right, to Christ, right? I said, I don't know what this is all about. I want to follow you. And I went the next day and I did as good Christians do and bought a Bible. I asked my mom to drive me to the Treasure House, the local Christian book supply store, I think it was called back then, no longer in business because Amazon, I think, has taken over those places. But it was a lovely little Christian bookstore. My mom was very supportive of me and thought, I don't know what he's doing, but he's not in trouble. He's staying, he's a great kid. He wants to go to church now. Great. Like, they thought it was just wonderful. So it drove me there. I got a New King James Extreme Teen Study Bible. I just got the one that the lady behind the counter suggested for me as a new Christian. And I began to read that from page 1, right? Which is the mistake that all I think new Christians make, is to begin from the very first page of Genesis. Yes. I got middle of Numbers and I thought, what am I doing here? Yeah. Like, what does this mean? But I did. I was so on fire. I was reading that Bible every morning with my orange juice, every morning at breakfast as a teen. On my summer off school, reading my Bible every morning and loving it. Eventually someone said, hey, go ahead to the Gospels and start there. I didn't know what New and Old Testament was at the time. So I had no idea where it even began or started. It was all new for me, but I began to really dig in there. I found a local youth group that was a better fit for me than my friend Brent's youth group, because it was kind of far away and it was a drive to get there. And so I kind of went out on my own and found a closer youth group that I went to, and a different day, made some great friends there. And then, my high school time, the rest of high school was really defined by those friend groups. I made some awesome friends in youth group. We were a tight knit group of friends. We would, go after youth group on a Friday night to McDonald's, and we'd talk about Calvinism until we were kicked out, at 11 p.m. when they closed the restaurant. We dug deep into these meaty, these heavy topics of theology as a youth group. And it really was in those experiences where I first began to ask questions about the Christian faith, right? It was, I can remember one distinct conversation or kind of argument in our youth group where one guy began reading some Calvinist ideas, right? Predestination, free will, these ideas of Calvinism, and brought those ideas into our youth group discussions. And so we're there at McDonald's debating free will and predestination, and he's, offering these proof texts. And I watched some very good friends at that point begin to walk away from the faith, actually, because they thought, well, he's saying these things. I'm not sure I'm part of the elect. I'm not sure I'm part of these saved Christians. Maybe I don't belong here. Yeah. And I had friends who haven't come back. They left in high school and never came back because those questions led them to begin to question their faith more deeply. And they thought, well, if I have doubts and questions, maybe I'm not part of this elect. I'm not saved according to Calvinism. And actually, if I remember correctly, I think our senior pastor had to come into our youth group one Friday night and gave a little mini lecture sermon on what we as Pentecostals in this youth group, what we believed about these things and why we believed them, to kind of counteract some of this kind of confusion these teens were experiencing in the youth group. So those were early seeds I see now to questioning the idea of sola scriptura and how can we understand our Bible apart from some kind of authoritative body, right? But
so when you mentioned Pentecostal, I'm always curious about this. Was it very heavy in the movement of the Spirit? Because I know that there are different varieties of Pentecostalism. I'm just curious because in our background, it definitely was a big part of it.
Yeah. Well, we joked that it was Baptist-costal. We called it often Baptist-costal because it was more of a Baptist flavor of Pentecostalism in this particular church. It started out, I think, and there were shades of the charismatic movement in there. There was occasionally a woman who'd speak in tongues on a Sunday morning. There was a guy who brought flags occasionally. If you know the flag movement, it was quite big in charismatic
I don't know
circles.
about the flag movement.
Oh, we had lots of flags up here in Canada. So, waving flags during the worship service.
Oh,
right?
got it. Okay.
These kinds of things. So there were flavors of that, but where I experienced that mostly was in some of the youth retreats you go on, those kind of things. So our church was kind of Baptist-costal, not super charismatic, but churches as a part of our same umbrella of the denominational umbrella would be a lot more charismatic. And so you encounter those sometimes at youth retreats or when you'd go to a different church for a conference or something.
Watching people get slain in the Spirit. And
and actually, again, like those are some of the things, Eddie, that really, gosh, the early seeds that were planted for me about that again, made me wonder about the idea of authority and how do we know this is the right way of understanding the Bible. I was maybe 16, 17 years old when I went to with a friend of mine, a very charismatic Pentecostal church service on like a Wednesday night, like a young adults kind of charismatic worship service in downtown Toronto. And it was there where somebody kind of, it was very, people were falling over. There were people speaking in tongues. There's very charismatic, very, in one sense, Holy Spirit filled. There's some really intense worship music. People are genuinely loving the Lord in this kind of service, but there's opportunity to go forward and have kind of a message from the Lord laid over your life or something like that was kind of what they said, I think, in those kind of contexts. So somebody's going to speak kind of prophetically into your life. And these people who they've identified as having some kind of gift of prophecy or gift of being able to really speak into your life or discern your journey, right? And so I went up to the front and I remember this person, this big guy, this big African-American guy, put his hand on my head and said to me, have you received a vision? And I know now he was channeling somewhere in Daniel, talking about young men seeing visions and dreaming dreams and these texts that we as charismatic Christians used. And I said, no, not really. And he said, well, you need to. You know, he was kind of taken aback. I think yes was the right answer in that context. And I said no. And he was taken aback and kind of said, well, you need to. Like, what's wrong with you? And I left not feeling edified and built up. I left feeling confused. Like, well, maybe I should. Like, am I not a good enough Christian? I don't have a message or a vision for my life yet from God. Am I not good enough? And again, those early seeds were planted that well, his interpretation of that passage of Daniel is this way, right? That I must have this, but says who? That's his interpretation, right? So again, those early seeds were planted for me that later on would begin to fruit with the question of, well, says who? Like, whose authority are these interpretations being made, right?
Well, the other thing that's fascinating about that, because I had the similar experience, when you go up for whatever that word is, it's assumed that you're going to affirm or be in agreement with whatever is said, because whatever is said is going to be a positive claim. It's going to be a positive word over your life. It's not going to be, I don't know all the tarot psychic stuff, but it's not going to be like the death card that's handed to you, right? It's going to be always this positive thing. So you go up already pretty excited about, okay, what is this person going to say? What are they going to prophesy
Yeah.
over me? And so I think in many respects, it gets very emotional as you're walking up. It's almost like, and I saw this with other people,
Yeah.
you've already made a commitment to agreeing with what they've said. And the fact that you said no,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, I've heard similar stories where it really shocks the person. And I've heard that in the realm of healing as well. Like, okay, now what do you feel? My neck still hurts. Well,
Yeah.
we're going to do this again until that pain goes away. So
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
psychology involved in that, the Lord wants to heal you right now. Well, over time that became anyway, I don't want to get off too much, but I understand what you're saying 100%.
And it's those early, the question of authority, like, so what gives this person the authority to speak that over my life and to say, no, something's wrong with you if you don't do that, or if you aren't healed, right? That there are abusive dynamics sometimes in the Catholic Church, of course. Sure, we have all kinds of examples of
Of
bad
course,
bishops acting badly and bad
of
priests. I've
course.
in my own life encountered bad priests, unfortunately, and our family has dealt with that in different ways. But that dynamic is very dangerous when you're speaking into somebody's life. Well, by whose authority, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, from there, I really had an amazing teenage years, and just growing deeply in my faith, and loving that group that I was in with for the most part, and digging deeply. And I went away to university, and I was really, again, just blessed by an amazing faith community. A friend of mine who was in the youth group with me, who's a year ahead of me, went ahead to this university that I was going to as well, and found this amazing student church, a really vibrant student church. We met on the campus pub on Monday nights, and we packed the pub out. It was like 500 people, standing room only, amazing worship band, just rocking out. The pastor with these great big dreadlocks, awesome guy with really relevant messages, and really, a bunch of really on fire Christians in this group. And met my wife there. We ended up, going to this together, and I would drive her there and got to know her better. And eventually we got married. But it was in that context then, when I graduated, and I worked for that church for 3 or 4 months after I graduated as an intern. And it was in that context when I really began asking questions about the Catholic Church. And it really began, I think, primarily, and I had met some Catholics along the way. One particular Catholic I became good friends with. His name was James, and we did a little exchange of services. So I went to mass with him one day, and it wasn't an evangelistic thing. It was just two guys who were friends who wanted to know each other's faith traditions a bit better, basically. And so I went to mass with him one day, and he came to my Monday night, church service one Monday. And what struck me going to mass with him, I didn't have a lot of interest in the Catholic faith at this point. I had these questions in the back of my mind, things kind of brewing, but wasn't going to become Catholic. And I went to this mass, and it was a noonday mass on campus, and struck by two things. The first was how diverse it was. I couldn't believe that people, professors down to like housewives with like 10 kids in tow, were here on campus on a Wednesday at noon at mass. Like, I had no idea there's this whole world I didn't even know existed, right? These people doing Catholic things right under my nose, right? I had no idea there was a noonday mass just down the hall from us at this lecture hall. And the second thing was really, I think in hindsight, my failing, my maybe ignorance or my ego or my hubris. But I remember the priest that said the mass, I watched him say mass and then quite literally run out of the chapel and was gone. And I thought, wow, yeah, those Catholics, right? Just ritual, just does his ritual and then he leaves, and that's it, right? And that, in hindsight, I've changed my opinion on what happened there. But at the time, it just kind of reaffirmed my Catholics just do ritual and they're done. There's no meet and greet. There's no hang around and chat. There's no fellowship. Now, in hindsight, he probably had a class to teach. He was on university campus, or somebody in the hospital to anoint, right? Or something else to do. Because I know now that priests are very busy people. But at the time, I thought these things, and I reflect now on how that's a lot of my ignorance and my arrogance, right? My hubris. and my chair, Eddie, is broken. So it slowly goes down. You'll see me just sinking.
Well, I might have to
occasionally.
join you in solidarity and start lowering mine as we.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
We'll keep it even. But that was an interesting experience for me going to mass. Then I brought him to my student church, and his takeaway was, wow, that was loud, a lot of music. And I thought, yeah, it was loud, right? That was his takeaway. And now that I go to mass regularly, I get it, right? He sees my service. There was no Eucharist, there was no communion, there was no no time of communal confession, no time of deep prayer. There was loud worship music. There was a pastor with dreadlocks giving an awesome sermon, and that was it, right? So I can imagine now him as a Catholic going to my church and going, yeah, that was loud. that was different, right? It's so dissimilar. So that was my first experience of really going to mass. But then working at this church, I ended up working for the associate pastor, I guess would be his title, became very good friends. And he was raised Roman Catholic in Montreal, Quebec, in what was very much, the absolute gold standard for Catholicism in North America for a long time. Quebec, a very Catholic, French Catholic province up here in Canada. They got hit so badly by secularism, right, in the 60s, that now it's the least Catholic part of North America. With the best cathedrals and the most beautiful churches you can find in Canada, but no one inside of them anymore, unfortunately. And so he was this guy raised Catholic, now a non-denominational, pastor at a youth church. And it turns out he was doing his master's degree in kind of early church studies. And he'd come back from his Wednesday night classes, and I'd be the guy the next morning he would chat with and bounce ideas off of that he was thinking of, that he'd heard in lecture or was working on a paper or something, right? And so I was his sounding board, it turns out. And I'll never forget the one thing that really drove me deeper was one afternoon, called me into his office, very hip office, very, mood lighting and cool posters on the walls, very, very hip, like student church office, right? And he said to me, Keith, I'm just thinking this thing through, but I wonder what you think. What do you think is more important, the Bible or tradition? And that for me is the question that launched 1,000 questions for me, right? I thought, okay, what a weird question, the Bible or tradition? First of all, tradition for me as a non-denominational quasi-Pentecostal Christian was one of those bad words, right? It was the Pharisees. It was those guys that didn't know Jesus, practiced tradition, right? That was always what we as non-Catholic Christians would say was the worst part of being Catholic, or being, the other mainline traditional denominations, right? That was a bad word, tradition. So I said, of course, well, it's the Bible. It's the Bible. And he said, I'll never forget, well, yeah, but where did the Bible come from? Who put that Bible together? And I went, yeah, who did? That for me was a revelation, right? So I hadn't really thought about it before. I got this Bible from the treasure house when I was a teenager. I got several Bibles since then. I'd read the Bible cover to cover many times throughout university. I went to Bible studies. I knew the Bible well. I read theologians and all kinds of Christian books about the Bible and God and all these things. But I hadn't thought about where the Bible came from. And that for me was kind of an awakening to ask those deeper questions, right? And so I began from there, going on to a serious journey, trying to answer that question, right? Began reading different books about the Bible and trying to find in my, non-denominational Christian tradition, authors who could answer that question, or people who could answer that question. He had no answer for me at the time and never gave an answer. He went on to not become Catholic, funny enough, even though his question launched me onto a journey becoming Catholic. And I learned later, Eddie, that there was somebody else that he knew from his seminar that he was taking for his master's, who also became Catholic out of these kind of conversations. And so I met that guy, his name is Joe, years later, when someone said, hey, you're a convert, you should meet Joe. And I met Joe, and Joe said, oh, introduced himself and put pieces together that we are both, talking in the same context with the same pastor on different ends of different sides of the conversation, having the same conversation. Me and Joe became Catholic out of these conversations, and Dom, the pastor, well, he's still a pastor, and we're still praying for him. He's on his way. He's just taking the long way around.
He's still in that in that denomination, or
he's a different non-denomination now, but he's back in Montreal again, back in the, what was the Mecca for Catholics in Canada. He's right in the thick of it there. So I'm praying for him. I think he's just taking the long way, a circuitous journey back to the church. But that was for me what kind of launched things. And then I began reading a lot, looking into things a lot. I got married and put that kind of on the back burner a little bit. Like that was always, my wife knew that I was interested in these kinds of topics, but it wasn't really a thing I was investigating too deeply when we got married, and it took some time to be married and stuff. And we really, we got married in that same church where Dom, that pastor, worked. He moved on at that point, but the pastor who started the student church eventually grew it into a family church. And so we remained part of that family church, same church we went to as, first university kind of thing. Got married in that church, met most of our friends in that church or brought them to that church from other churches as they saw what we had there. They wanted to be part of that as well. So we loved that for a long time. And I began kind of asking those questions and slowly looking into things. And I think when it became really in depth for me was when the church began to go through and ask questions about marriage and sexuality and these kind of topics that were emerging, early to mid 2000s, questions. Up here in Canada, we legalized same-sex marriage pretty early on. And that was an active question in the Christian church in Canada, in the early 2000s, mid 2000s. And for me, those kind of questions began to really, again, bring back those issues of authority and who decides, right? Because I realized that us as a church, as a non-denominational church, we're trying to figure out what we believed on these kinds of things. Who could be married in our church? What do we believe about sexuality? What do we, as this body of Christians, affirm? What do we believe? And I began to realize that no matter which side of the argument you want to look at, they all were using the same verses, exact same number of verses in the same places in the Bible, interpreting them differently and kind of pitting them against one another. And I kind of thought, well, there's got to be a different way of doing this, because how do we know who's right when we're looking at the exact same kind of verses, just using them different ways or using other verses to prop up these verses? And there was no clear way of knowing who was right in my mind. And I began to ask, well, how do we know how to answer these questions? And I began kind of looking elsewhere for other ways of knowing things. And that brought me back to my time, my memory, these ideas of tradition and the Bible and kind of which came first. And I began looking more seriously into traditional things. So I had some friends who become Orthodox Christians. And so I asked them some questions, but I saw pretty quickly in my mind that the Orthodox Church was not more united than the Protestant Church in my mind. There were different kind of regional or ethnic kind of groups of Orthodox Christians, and they couldn't really agree amongst themselves. They couldn't really, as a group come to agreements. I think now because the papacy is lacking that authority structure in the Orthodox Church. But at the time I saw that as not a viable option. So I began to look at the Catholic Church a bit more seriously and think, okay, well, they have this tradition thing. It seems like they know what they're doing, and it seems like they have a way of agreeing and a way of making judgments that are authoritative and saying, this is what you believe, this is why you believe it. And I began to slowly read about the Catholic Church from non-Catholic sources, right? Which I was trepidatious to begin to read actual Catholic sources. I wanted to read what was comfortable and familiar to me. So authors who were kind of in my wheelhouse, in my circle of Christians who are writing about the Catholic Church. And I got some glimpses, and I know now a lot of not misinformation, but just bad information, right? Misunderstandings, right? They didn't understand what they were talking about in many cases. And at one point I just Googled, because Google is a thing now. I could Google things. So I Googled like, do evangelicals become Catholic? thinking I'd get nothing, thinking that nothing would appear. And to my surprise, I found lists of books of evangelicals who became Catholic. I was shocked. I thought, why? I couldn't see the route. I couldn't see how you could possibly leave evangelical Christianity, even with all of its problems and problems of I can't figure out what I believe and how I believe it and how I know this is the right thing to believe. I couldn't see how anybody could make that leap, right? And so I was curious to find out that many people did make that leap. And so I began to go through that list of books that I found, right? Familiar books like Scott Hahn, right? Thomas Howard, Steve Ray, these kind of books of Protestants, of evangelicals who really knew their stuff and were on fire for their faith and were serious, and their seriousness led them to become Catholic. And time again in these stories, I think I finished, I was reading on my Kobo, my Kindle, my e-reader, Rome Sweet Home by Scott and Kimberly Hahn, right? The very famous conversion story that has spawned 1 million conversions. And I was reading kind of in secrets, and I thought I was being very clever and no one knew. My wife, as it turns out, knew quite easily could tell what I was reading and knew quite quickly just what was going on here. But I finished that book and I began it over again right away. I finished it, went right back to page 1 and went right back through it again 2 more times right in a row, because I could not believe that people who were serious Christians could ever become Catholic. But the things I was reading in these books, these conversion stories, and I began to then read about, the rosary, about Mary, about the Eucharist, the Mass, ordering just all kinds of books off Amazon and finding free books from places on the internet that I could find free books. The Knights of Columbus at one point were giving away free books on like the Eucharist and on Mary. So I ordered those books and devoured those books, and slowly was reading these things and realizing that, serious people, serious Christians actually become Catholic, and there are good reasons to do so. I learned about the magisterium, right? The idea that the bishops in succession, all the way from the apostles down through all of time, right, had the power to actually bind and loose. Go figure, it's right in the Bible, right? To actually authoritatively teach things. So, on issues like sexuality or on marriage that I in my church wrestled with, well, the Catholic Church can say, here's what we believe. And we ground this in our interpretation of the Bible, which is handed down through tradition, and it is affirmed by the bishops, who can make those kind of judgments because they believe, as Catholics, I came to believe, that authority comes from Christ, that they can't be wrong. They're protected from making a mistake because they have that authority. And here's the Pope, who unites all of these kind of ideas. And as I began to read more things and understand the Catholic faith, really for the first time, I had some misconceptions about what the Catholic faith was, this idea of ritual, right? That priest doing Mass and running away, right? My different experiences along the way of what Catholics did and were doing and what they believed. When I began to actually unpack those things, I realized that this is the answer to all those things, all those questions that I had all along, right? Yeah. This is what would have prevented my youth group from splintering way back when we couldn't figure out which interpretation was the right one, right? This explains why that guy in that charismatic, revival meeting I went to, why he can interpret this thing one way, but the Catholic Church says, no, you don't have to have visions of the end times to be a good Catholic. Here's how you be a good Catholic, right? I began to realize that the Catholic faith made a lot of sense of how to be Christian, and it had this holistic approach to everything, right? I realized really quickly that, and I found the Catechism at one point. And the Catechism is an absolute goldmine for what for beautiful theology, and really explains what the Church believes just in such fascinating detail and hems it all together. But I realized, Eddie, that the reason why the Catholic Church says that a man and woman, must be married, it has to be a man and a woman, it comes from the same body of teaching that explains why only men can be priests. Sure. Like that comes from the same place, the same deposit of faith, the same logic, the same theological reasoning, the same heart, is behind both those ideas. And I realized that all these things work together, where I had this very disjointed theology that came from different authors I had read as a non-Catholic Christian. I read some Dallas Dallas Willard here and Eugene Peterson here, and some, and different some Donald Miller over here, these different authors who I would read, who would have different ideas that I would try and, in my faith experience, kind of mold together, right? Fit together. And they would often disagree on things too, that I'd have to kind of just figure out, well, how can I hold these things in tension, right? That became, at the later end of my wife and I's experience in this non-denominational church, that became kind of the buzzword for a lot of these ideas around marriage and gender and sexuality. We're holding things in tension, right? Because we didn't know which side to rule on, because different theologians that we were reading and were forming our thinking had different ideas.
That is fascinating.
Right? But I found the Catholic Church and found this cohesiveness that all these parts fit together.
Yeah.
And I don't have to be the one to fit them together myself. Right?
Yes.
They're already fit. I can discover how they fit, and they do fit, but I don't have to do all the work to fit them together myself and live in that tension of, well, do I have this right? Do I have this wrong? Is this the theology of the day, or is this a trend, or is this really the ancient kind of faith? And I think for me, discovering that was just, this kind of blew my mind, really. And I began at that point just to go hog wild, I think. The thing I would change now, looking back, is I'd inform my wife a little earlier on of my intentions, I think, because before we had kids, back in the day, she'd go to bed and I'd be up till 2 or 3 in the morning on YouTube, just binging Journey Home episodes, binging Scott Hahn lectures. There's a lovely church, Father John Ricardo. I've met him and thanked him in person now, because they filmed all their RCIA videos, classes for 2 or 3 years worth. That parish, Our Lady of Good Counsel in Plymouth, Michigan, not far from us now that we've moved. They recorded all their RCIA classes, these classes for new Catholics, right? And I ended up binge watching those, just class after class, 3-hour-long lectures from some of these brilliant priests who are also accomplished theologians, unpacking the Catholic faith. And the more I heard, the more I was like, yes, this makes sense. This all fits together. This explains things I couldn't understand before as a Christian.
Yeah.
And it just drew me deeper and deeper. And then I told my wife that I think I might become Catholic. And
how did you respond to that?
Well, it was, I think, one of our first big fights that we had. We've been married for a number of years at this time. We weren't newlyweds by any stretch of the imagination. But I remember telling her, and we were on the same, faith page for everything, for always, right? We met at this church together. All our friends were there. We were married in this church. We were involved in, but every part of ministry in this church we could be as we went along, right? We started off in missions ministry, and then in small groups, and then we were helping to run the marriage seminar at this church. So for us, like, being on different pages with our faith was a big deal. It was strange and unusual. And am I married to a Catholic now? Like, was the question that she was wrestling with. But what happened that was amazing in that situation was we had this kind of big, knock him down, drag him out argument, a real fight, like a real barn burning fight at that point, over, me kind of dropping this bomb, into our marriage. And in hindsight, I've talked to so many male converts, Eddie, who have the same problem I had, who go along this journey and wait till the last minute, say, oh, by the way, honey, I'm becoming Catholic. So I wasn't unique in this journey, but it wasn't a good experience nonetheless. I should have done it a bit differently, I think, in hindsight. But she went off that night and slept downstairs. I slept in a different room. We couldn't reconcile that night. It was a big fight. But the next morning, and I should say, that was the first time I ever thought about asking a saint to pray for me. Right? I was on this journey. I'd learned all about the community of the saints and about Mary. And I prayed and asked Mary, undoer of knots, to pray for me, to pray for this situation. And that night, sitting on that bed, big fight, tears in my eyes, big mess. Thought, what have I done to our marriage? Like, what have I? We weren't breaking up. We weren't. Marriage was for us a serious commitment. But I thought, how can we have different faiths in this marriage? How is this going to work logistically? When we have kids on a Sunday morning, like, our journeys are going to be different now forever. And I couldn't see a way of reconciling in that moment. It just felt like there's no way. This is way too big. She's not anywhere near me on this journey. So I prayed this prayer, asked Mary for help, and went to bed, very hopeless, feeling very hopeless at this point. And the next morning we wake up and my wife busts into the room and she begins to explain to me the Catholic view of women, all these ideas of why women can't be priests and why women, why marriage is this. And I thought, where's this coming from? And it turns out that I went to bed. She went downstairs on the computer and researched, till late in the night.
Yeah.
Some of the questions that she had initially about the Catholic Church and had them answered with pretty good answers. And I thought, wow, right? Like my first prayer to ask Mary for help results in this cataclysmic shift from like at night, hopeless desperation to in the morning, okay, there are some answers, and she likes the answers and we're moving forward. And so I ended up becoming Catholic that year, went through RCIA myself. My wife was very supportive of it. She kind of understood. We did a bit of double dipping. So I go to mass on a Sunday morning and then come with her to our non-denominational church. We had a son in the meantime. Our first son, Samuel, was born. And before we even had to begin to talk about, do we baptize him? Because I'm Catholic and she's not. She kind of said, you know what? I think I might start RCIA. And what I think one of the things that I should back up a little bit that was a kind of a catalyst for that, Eddie, was we thought it was a good, in hindsight, not great, but went to a marriage counselor to work out these ideas, right? How do we continue in a healthy marriage when we're on different pages? And it turns out we did some research and we thought it was a good marriage counselor. He had great accreditation. He had all kinds of great recommendations and had done all kinds of great work. He was Mennonite, so kind of, not in middle.
I was going to say nice middle ground there.
Yeah, middle ground, right? So we got there. Turns out he was divorced. So right away it was kind of like a red flag, a divorced marriage counselor. Okay, whatever. But it turned out when we kind of brought these topics up, he began to kind of grill me over like why I was becoming Catholic, what was drawing me into this, why I was doing this.
Wow.
And began to push back against my ideas and really just kind of debate me. And it was my wife, Maria, who came to my defense and began to rebut him with really good Catholic answers to these things he was bringing up. And so I think, we owe him a great debt and a lot of money. We paid to him, unfortunately as well, but owe him a debt for, I think, sharpening our thinking and allowing, my wife to begin to defend a faith she wasn't even a part of yet. And to realize how good those answers were, right? She kind of heard me talking about those things. We'd had those conversations ongoing once I dropped that bomb that one night. We kept on talking about it. And she'd heard enough to know how to defend the Catholic faith to somebody who was kind of pushing back against it. And so I think those kind of experiences for her, and that in particular, solidified in her the idea that, okay, well, I'm going to explore this, that one step deeper. And thank God she found a great parish. We'd kind of moved a bit since then. So it wasn't the parish that I did my class through. A great parish that really, spoke the truth of the faith in love, had teachers that really knew the Catholic faith. And we ended up having a beautiful situation where, she was received in the church. And then that next Sunday, we had our son baptized once both of us were Catholic.
Beautiful.
And it was an amazing experience. And we've only dug deeper since then. It's been an incredible journey. And awesome to think that, I've talked to a lot of people on my show that it's not the case, right? That they become Catholic and for a long time are the only Catholic in the family and just pray their spouse would follow them, right? And in many cases, this happens. It does, right? God is good, and spouses who follow the Holy Spirit will eventually, I think, hear that call into the Catholic Church. I'm grateful that it happened the way it did so quickly, that we were able to reconcile like that and be Catholic together, and then now continue to do our marriage and life as Catholics, and no turning back. It's been an incredible journey. And when I first became Catholic, I had some friends who said to me, it's great to become Catholic. That's awesome. You're very zealous now. You're full of gumption. You love being Catholic. just know that'll wear out. Like, be prepared when that kind of fades away and you're kind of just bored being Catholic, like you were bored being evangelical, right? And you wanted something new. And I took that with a grain of salt. They're well-meaning people and well-meaning, a warning, right? You might burn out. Don't worry. That's maybe natural. The opposite for me has happened though, right? And I had Scott Hahn on my show once, which was an amazing, surreal experience to have on the show. This guy that I read his book, like, in the backseat of the car on vacation, like, I talked to him on my show. That's just a weird experience. But he said the same thing. He said after 25 years plus, I think maybe 30 years now, as a Catholic, he's more in love with the Eucharist and the faith than he ever was before. And that's for me the same resonance, right? I am not bored of being Catholic. I'm more excited to be Catholic than I ever was before, than I was yesterday. It's a deepening relationship, experiencing the sacraments on that rhythm, that weekly Sunday Mass rhythm of the sacraments, just draws you deeper and deeper into the mystery of the faith, I think. And that it's not a thing, I think, if you understand, that you burn out from. You just grow more and more in love with that experience. And I think that's where we are. That's where we're going. It's been an amazing experience. And I mean,
how many years ago was that you converted?
So I began blogging in 2014, before I was Catholic, and converted in 2015. So fast math, it's a number of years. It's a whole bunch of years.
Something you said that was fascinating to me is the tension when you're trying to cobble together these different ideas, and you realize how many millions of people, men and women, there are in that space right now, and that basically becomes a worldview. Even if you're not fully committed to this, even an indecision is a decision, of course. And so I just wonder how many people listen to different philosophers and different politicians, and they start to try to make sense of, okay, where do I stand? And then I believe this is where we start to get statements like, well, it's my truth. It's what I arrived at, even though it's not some objective reality. It's just what you have to claim to probably alleviate a lot of what's going on in your head. Well, I'm just going to call it my truth. But that was fascinating to me because, again, there must be millions upon millions that are in that space right now. I'm not saying they're necessarily, certainly not necessarily looking to the Catholic faith, but they're looking for objective truth, and you're gonna find it if you continue to humbly look for it.
Yeah. And that's in the Christian church, the non-Catholic Christian community, and that's outside, right? That's the bigger world looking for meaning, right? In these things. And even in these Christian churches, these people that are wrestling with these things, interestingly enough, I didn't mention this in my story, but I had two very, very close friends who some of my closest friends who've left the faith entirely for reasons very similar to why I became Catholic. We were for a very long time on similar trajectories, right? Asking, well, how can I know which of these ideas is right? How can I know what truth of the Bible is the actual truth and not my interpretation of this? And why is mine right and this guy's is wrong? They answered those questions by saying, well, there's no answer. So the Bible is wrong. So I can't be Christian anymore, right? That simplifies it. But that was kind of their response. Well, very similar journey to mine, only I went this way and said, oh no, here's where I think authority claims can be made safely. The church holds this thing, in authority. They saw, no, nothing does. And so they went this way. But for a long time, very similar journeys, right? On the same trajectory, just different kind of conclusions. And I think that for me is so fascinating. There are a lot of these people, especially these ex-evangelical, these former evangelical Christians who've left those traditions, time and time again, when you read or you hear about why they've left, is because they couldn't reconcile a small piece of their theology that we as Catholics go, oh yeah, well that fits here. Here's how that's answered.
Now,
right?
do you
they don't
think,
know, they haven't seen or heard, right, those answers, right?
And do you think that a lot of them just, like in your case, they just look at Catholicism and say, Okay, you talked about that chasm, and you actually wanted to understand how people
Yeah.
would even make that leap. But there have got to be a lot of people that say that leap is simply too big. I'm out altogether. Or what? Maybe they wouldn't even look that there's a potential answer over there, because Catholicism, for a lot of people, it's been driven into them that it's so horribly wrong. Why would I consider it? And they may not even think of it as an intellectual avenue whatsoever. I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that it's in large part not a live option for a lot of these people that
Yeah.
I know, right? And some of these people are influenced by maybe former Catholics they knew who had ideas that weren't quite accurate about the church, right? Or Catholics they knew who weren't really living out their faith. They
Yeah.
saw those ritualistic aspects, and they saw those Catholics who on a Sunday morning are doing the motions, and then or on a Saturday night are partying their face off, right? And then on a Sunday morning they're doing the motions, and you go, well, how is this reconcilable? How is this what Catholics are, right? I think a lot of those bad witnesses and bad catechesis that made kind of bad Catholics, who then showed that bad Catholicism to those who were watching, right? And so I think for a lot of people that were in those circles that I knew, it wasn't even a live option to become Catholic. It wasn't something that we would take seriously. Why become Catholic? Like what's in that for me? It's an empty, dead ritual with these old white guys who wear these weird robes on a Sunday morning, right? But I think it takes, and I hope it takes people like us, like your show, like my show, like, this is for me the heart of the thing that I want to do is show the beauty, a picture what the church actually believes and actually understands and actually talks about what it means to be an actual Catholic, right? Apart from bad examples, and I'm certainly a bad example too on most days, but I come on here and I try and show the good side of Catholicism. But I think that's what I hope is going to be filling in that gap. And I think back to that famous quote from Pope Benedict the 16th, that the church, must become smaller or will become smaller. The Catholic Church, right? Those hangers on that are kind of marginally Catholic, they're maybe raised Catholic and have kind of don't practice the faith, but still call themselves Catholic. We're going to get to a point in the world, in society, where the practice of our faith is going to have to be taken seriously or just abandoned. I think the church, and not that I want to abandon all these so-called Catholics. I want to invite them into a deeper relationship, but the church will, I think, by necessity begin to look more Catholic, authentically Catholic, because it's going to have to be, right? It's going to look more and more different than the world as the world continues to change, right? And Catholics will be.
Oh, you're saying the difference will grow. Exactly.
Yeah, I think the difference is going to have to grow, I think, right? So, yeah.
Fascinating. So I do want to cover this before I let you go. So your channel, Cordial Catholic, when did it start? What is its aim? I mean, I think you partially answered that just a second ago. And I think maybe just those two areas.
Yeah. So I blogged from 2014 onward, and I began to feel a nudge toward this podcasting sphere. I've always loved podcasting ever since I used to hook up my iPod with a cable to my computer and run a program, turn it on every morning at 6 a.m. before work or before school. And it would run this program to query these RSS feeds to download these podcasts. Like this is classic. Like proto podcasting. So I've loved podcasting for a very, very long time. I love the medium. I didn't mention this earlier, but one of the things that got me looking into the Catholic Church, asking more serious questions after that first question from that pastor, was a show called The Daily Break with a guy called Father Roderick, who's out of the Netherlands. He's a Dutch podcasting priest, most famous now for his Star Wars reaction videos. He's the priest that loves Star Wars, and he's a wonderful guy. I used to listen to his podcast before I even realized he was Catholic. I wasn't listening very closely enough to his Dutch accent to realize he was saying, "I'm Father Roderick." I just heard whatever Roderick. I realized he was a Dutch priest and went, "Oh wow, listen to this podcast for a few months. This guy's pretty cool. He likes video games. He likes music. He likes movies. He talks about these things. He's a Catholic. Like, wow, this is possible." Yeah. So he was a guy that got me. Excuse me. His podcast was a podcast that got me loving podcasts and that medium, right? The idea of somebody being in your ear and you beginning to know more intimately and begin, listening to and respecting and growing to know. And so I had this niggling feeling to try podcasting. And so I think it was about 4 years ago now that I dusted off my old recording equipment that I used in high school to record emo songs, Eddie, in my bedroom.
Yes.
I pulled that back out of storage, old analog equipment, and hooked that up to my computer through a couple of fancy devices, and just began telling my story. And I owe a great debt to my good friend, Dr. Doug Beaumont, who was brave enough to be on episode 4 of my show very early on. And
I'd love to chat with him.
That got the ball rolling for these fantastic guests to explain the faith from the heart of the church, right? And a lot of what I do is that, and tell conversion stories, tell stories of people who've become Catholic, because that, for me, like, those stories are what explains the faith so well sometimes to outsiders. Like, why would an Anglican priest become Catholic, leave their priesthood as Anglican to become Catholic, right? Why would this author of hundreds of Christian fiction books ever become Catholic, right? Why would these people make these conversion stories, make these conversions, make these leaps? Like, what draws them in? So telling those stories is a big part of what I do. And then answering those questions that always seem to come up for non-Catholic Christians, and the saints, purgatory, heaven, hell, the Eucharist, the confession, these kinds of things, to try to explain from the heart of the church what we actually believe as Catholics in a compelling way that really explains what we believe and why, right? So to hear it right from the church. So that's been my jam for the last 4 years or so. It's not slowing down. It has been, but my voice has been struggling the last few weeks with some colds, but it's barreling full steam ahead. I love it. It's been an amazing experience, and just so many awesome guests and so much amazing feedback from people all over the world. Like, I feel very unqualified to do this most days when I'm getting emails from, hey, I'm an Episcopalian priest down in Florida becoming Catholic. Like, what do I do? And I go, oh, I don't know. I'm not. Go ask Marcus Grodi at the Journey Home. Go ask those guys. I point them towards them more often than not, and then they steal my guests after they've been on my show because I point them towards them. But it's a good relationship that we have, very reciprocal. But it's been an amazing journey. I don't know why I'm qualified to do this, but it keeps happening. It keeps working out time after time. When I think that it can't go any further, it goes deeper. If I can tell one story about why I keep doing it, it's a Padre Pio story. And my favorite kind of Padre Pio story, I love Padre Pio. I grew up watching X-Files and Unsolved Mysteries and those awesome, spooky, creepy shows, right? And so a guy like Padre Pio is my thing, right? Guy who could walk through walls and who could know people's like thoughts and bilocate and like had the stigmata. He's an interesting character for me, right? And so I've always kind of had an affinity with Padre Pio. And I had this experience, Eddie, of almost quitting the show. I'd been blogging for a while. I began the podcast. I was maybe like 6 episodes in or something, and it wasn't getting a lot of traction. It was a lot of work. I was putting in like 5-6 hours per episode trying to edit things. I was a total newbie, didn't know what I was doing, right? Cutting things together and figuring out how to edit episodes. And one night washing dishes, I said a little prayer. I said, you know what? Padre Pio, pray for me, because I need to know if this is the right course, because I could use my time elsewhere. I could go volunteer at RCAA. I could go lead a Bible study. I could do more, double down in the blogging. I could do whatever. Is this a waste of my time, or should I keep on podcasting? What should I do? So I said that prayer, and moments later, no more than an hour later, I get an email on my phone. I look down, my hands are all, dry my hands off from doing the dishes, and look at my phone, and it's an email from this guy saying, hey, I love your show. It's been a blessing. It's awesome. Thank you for all that you do. Like, this is great. Keep going. And that was like, oh wow, that's a cool affirmation. Like, I appreciate that. Then he signs the email, CEO of the Padre Pio Center of North America. And I think I dropped my phone, right? And I thought, And his name is Nick Gaboni, and we're now good friends, and I've had him on the show along with somebody who's one of the daughters of the founders of the center in the States. I think it's down in Pennsylvania, this big Padre Pio center that was founded based on a miraculous healing of this woman's daughter.
Wow.
Through Padre Pio's intercession. She went over to Italy and had Padre Pio kind of pray for her, from a mile away, but had this healing happen. It was amazing. And so I had Nick and the daughter who was healed, on my show many years later. But I thought, wow, okay. So, I asked Padre Pio to pray for me. He sends his CEO for North America to email me to say, hey, keep on podcasting. So I figure if I should stop doing this thing, he'll send me a sign equally to say, hey, stop.
Hey, you gotta check out, maybe it was a month ago, I interviewed Deacon Lou Aaron. Look up the video.
Okay.
He had some incredible stories about Padre Pio. So
yeah, I love those.
Lou Aaron. In fact,
I love those
just
stories.
be on your show. There's when you're talking about reciprocity, like we could interview the same people and they're going to have a different angle.
Yes.
Tell. Yeah. And there are people I know very well that will listen to the same person several times because there's something so enlightening about that journey. So I think it's great. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your zeal. I say that to so many people, especially those that are actively doing things in video and audio. They're talking, and obviously those people that are not on audio and video, that are just at their local parishes, that are defending the faith and just being welcoming to everyone and being ready to explain the faith with a ton of zeal. So I appreciate that. And everyone, as usual, thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting the channel. And until next time, take care and God bless.